My name is Detective Sarah Martinez, and I've been with the Millfield Police Department for 12 years. What happened last October still makes me question how well any of us really know our neighbors. Sometimes the most disturbing crimes hide behind the most innocent facades, and what I discovered on Cedar Lane changed everything I thought I knew about community trust. It was October 15, 2023, around 2:30 p.m. on a cold, overcast afternoon when I got the call. The autumn rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning our small town's streets into rivers of yellow and orange leaves. Mrs. Helen Kowalski on Cedar Lane was reporting suspicious activity at her neighbor's property. Now, Helen was known for calling about everything from loud music to teenagers walking too slowly past her house, so I honestly expected another routine complaint about someone's garbage cans being placed incorrectly or a dog barking too early in the morning. I was driving Unit 23, a 2020 Ford Explorer Police Interceptor, when dispatch patched me through. The windshield wipers were working overtime against the persistent drizzle, and I had to turn up the radio volume to hear clearly over the weather. Detective Martinez, I know you probably think I'm being paranoid again, but there's something very wrong with what Richard Brennan has built in his backyard. Helen's voice was shaking more than usual. I've been watching him for weeks now, and that's not a treehouse for his boy Tommy. That thing he's built, it's pointed right at our houses. Richard Brennan had moved to Cedar Lane about 18 months earlier with his 8-year-old son after what neighbors assumed was a messy divorce. The story around town was that his ex-wife had gotten the house in Sacramento, and he'd chosen Millfield for its good schools and quiet neighborhoods. He seemed like a decent single father, quiet, kept his lawn meticulously maintained, always waved hello when you passed by. His white 2018 Honda Accord was always parked neatly in his driveway, and neighbors often saw him helping Tommy with homework on the front porch during nice weather. The wooden structure he'd been building in his large oak tree had been a neighborhood conversation piece for months. Most people thought it was sweet that he was building his son such an elaborate treehouse. The project had started in late spring, with Brennan spending every weekend hauling lumber and tools into his backyard. Neighbors would stop to chat over the fence, praising his craftsmanship and dedication to giving Tommy something special. When I arrived at Helen's house, she was waiting by her kitchen window with a pair of binoculars, her silver hair still in curlers from her morning routine. Her hands were trembling as she handed them to me, and I noticed she'd pulled all her curtains partially closed, something I'd never seen her do before. "Look at the angle of those windows," she whispered urgently, pointing toward Brennan's backyard. "They don't face down into the backyard where a child would play. They face directly into the Hendersons' master bedroom, the Williams' kitchen window, and my guest bathroom. I tested it this morning, stood in my bathroom and could see him looking right at me through those little windows." I raised the binoculars and felt my stomach drop. What I saw through the steady rainfall wasn't a child's playhouse at all. The structure was positioned about 15 feet up in the massive oak tree, carefully constructed with small, strategically placed windows cut at precise angles. The windows were narrow slits, almost like arrow loops in a medieval castle, designed for observation rather than ventilation or light. Even more disturbing, I could see what appeared to be camera equipment mounted inside, partially concealed by fake leaves and branches that had been woven into the natural foliage. "Mrs. Kowalski, how long has Mr. Brennan been up there today?" "He goes up every afternoon when the school bus drops Tommy off at 3:15, she explained, her voice getting more agitated. "Tells the boy to play in the front yard or go inside and do homework while he finishes the treehouse. Claims he's still working on safety features and doesn't want Tommy getting hurt. But detective, I've seen him up there with those cameras when Tommy's not even home. And at night." She paused, wrapping her arms around herself. "God help me, he's up there at night too. I've seen the glow from some kind of screen up there after midnight." I immediately called for backup and requested a warrant, explaining the situation to Sergeant Williams at the station. The rain was making everything more complicated. We need to move quickly before weather destroyed any potential evidence. Officer James Thompson arrived within 20 minutes in a 2019 Chevrolet Tahoe, and we began documenting everything we could see from public property. Through the binoculars, We identified at least 3 different camera angles, all directed toward neighboring houses rather than Brennan's own yard. The cameras appeared to be high-definition models, the kind used for professional surveillance, not casual photography. I could make out what looked like motion sensors and infrared equipment, suggesting these weren't just daytime observation tools. While waiting for the warrant, I decided to do some preliminary interviews with the neighbors. The Hendersons, a young couple with a 6-month-old baby, were horrified when I explained why I was there. They lived in a modest 2-story house directly across from Brennan's property, and their master bedroom faced his backyard. "We've felt like someone was watching us for months," Mrs. Jennifer Henderson said, clutching her baby closer to her chest. "I kept telling my husband I felt eyes on me when I was nursing the baby in our bedroom, even with the curtains partially drawn. He thought I was just being paranoid because of postpartum anxiety, but I swear I could feel someone staring." Mr. David Henderson's face went pale as the implications sank in. "Jesus Christ, we never closed the blinds completely because we like the natural light for the baby's room. Jennifer's been getting dressed in there, feeding the baby. That sick bastard has been watching my wife like we're some kind of television show." The Williams family, who lived in the house next to the Hendersons, had a similar story that made my skin crawl. Mrs. Patricia Williams had started covering their kitchen window with newspaper 3 weeks earlier because she felt uncomfortable cooking dinner, though she couldn't explain why at the time. "I thought I was losing my mind," Patricia admitted, wringing her hands nervously. "Every time I was preparing meals, especially in the evening when I had the overhead light on, I felt like someone was watching me. My husband thought I was being ridiculous, but I started cooking with just the stove light on and eventually just covered the whole window." Their teenage daughter Ashley had recently started changing clothes in the bathroom instead of her bedroom, claiming her room felt creepy, even though she couldn't identify why. The girl's bedroom window faced Brennan's backyard, with a clear sideline to his tree. "She's been having nightmares about someone watching her sleep," Patricia continued. "We thought it was just typical teenage anxiety, but now, oh God, what has that man seen?" By 4:15 p.m., I had the warrant in hand. Brennan's Honda Accord wasn't in the driveway. Helen informed me he typically picked Tommy up from after-school care at the elementary school around 5 p.m., giving us maybe 45 minutes to process the scene before he returned. The rain had intensified, which would help muffle any sounds we made but also make climbing more dangerous. Officer Thompson secured the perimeter while I approached the tree. Climbing up to that structure was one of the most disturbing experiences of my career. The wooden ladder Brennan had built was sturdy and professional, with non-slip treads and handrails clearly designed for regular use. As I climbed higher, the full scope of his surveillance operation became clear. What we found wasn't just casual voyeurism, it was systematic, methodical surveillance that had been planned with military precision. Brennan had installed 3 high-definition cameras with night vision capabilities, each positioned at different windows to maximize coverage of the surrounding properties. The cameras were professional-grade equipment, the kind used by private investigators or security companies, connected to a sophisticated digital recording system powered by a small solar panel hidden among the leaves. The interior of the structure was cramped but efficiently organized, like a surveillance blind used by wildlife photographers. Brennan had installed a small folding chair, a weather-resistant storage container, and even a mini refrigerator powered by the solar system. This wasn't a temporary setup, this was a permanent observation post designed for extended use. But the cameras were just the beginning of the horror. Inside the waterproof storage container, we found detailed notebooks with schedules of his neighbors' daily routines, written in meticulous handwriting with different colored pens for different households. He knew when Jennifer Henderson fed her baby every 2 hours during the day, usually at the rocking chair by the window. He knew when the Williams family ate dinner precisely at 6:30 p.m., with Patricia cooking while the family gathered in the kitchen. He had pages of notes about elderly Mr. Peterson next door, including when he took his evening heart medication and his weekly doctor appointments. The notebooks contained information no neighbors should know: who had visitors and when, who received packages and from which companies, who left their garage doors open and for how long, even which houses had mail delivered at what times. He documented the Hendersons' marital arguments, noting when David left for work angry and when Jennifer cried during late-night feedings. He knew Patricia Williams had been having trouble sleeping and often got up at 2 a.m. to make tea in her kitchen. Most chilling were the photographs. Hundreds of them, professionally printed and organized in manila folders labeled with street addresses. Pictures of women getting dressed, families eating meals, children playing in their yards. Some photos had been taken from the treehouse surveillance post, others from ground level, suggesting he'd been on their properties after dark, moving 3 yards to get closer shots. The pictures were organized chronologically and by subject. Jennifer Henderson nursing her baby. Patricia Williams cooking dinner. Ashley Williams doing homework at her desk. Mr. Peterson taking his medication. Even more disturbing were photos of people who clearly had no idea they were being watched, women in bathrooms, couples in bedrooms, families having private conversations in what they thought was the safety of their homes. Officer Thompson discovered the worst part while I was cataloging the camera equipment, a folder labeled Future Projects, containing detailed floor plans and maps. Somehow, Brennan had obtained or created architectural layouts of at least 6 houses on Cedar Lane, marking entry points, window locations, security systems, and daily schedules of residents. Each house plan was annotated with notes about the best observation angles, blind spots and current surveillance, and recommendations for enhanced monitoring capabilities. The floor plans were incredibly detailed, showing not just room layouts but furniture placement, indicating he'd been inside these houses or had access to real estate listings with interior photos. Some plans had red marks indicating what he called priority observation zones, bedrooms, bathrooms, and other private spaces. At 5:03 p.m., we heard a car door slam in the driveway. I radioed for additional units as I watched Brennan's Honda pull in through the rain. Through the kitchen window, I saw him helping his son Tommy out of the car, both of them bundling up against the weather, completely unaware that his elaborate surveillance operation had been discovered. Tommy was a small boy with his father's dark hair, wearing a yellow raincoat and carrying a superhero backpack. He looked excited, probably thinking his dad would finally let him see the finished treehouse. The sight of this innocent child made the whole situation even more sickening. The arrest was swift but heartbreaking. We waited until Brennan had gotten Tommy inside the house before moving in. When I knocked on the front door, Brennan answered with a smile, probably expecting a neighbor or delivery person. "Richard Brennan, you're under arrest for unlawful surveillance, invasion of privacy, and trespassing," I announced, showing him the warrant. His face went completely white, but he didn't resist. He just stood there in the doorway, rain soaking his hair, looking defeated. Tommy kept asking why the police were there, why his daddy was being handcuffed, why he couldn't see his treehouse. The boy's confusion and fear were heartbreaking. He had no idea what his father had really been doing up in that tree. "I was protecting the neighborhood," Brennan kept repeating as Officer Thompson placed him in the patrol car. "Someone has to keep watch. Someone has to make sure everyone's safe." During the initial interrogation at the station, the full scope of his operation became even more disturbing. Brennan had been planning what he called community security enhancement. Essentially, he intended to expand his surveillance network to cover the entire neighborhood. He'd already identified optimal locations for additional observation posts, including the community park and the roof of the local grocery store. He genuinely believed he was providing a valuable service, keeping everyone safe by monitoring their activities and identifying potential threats. When I asked him what threats he'd identified, he pulled out a separate notebook filled with paranoid observations: delivery drivers who stayed too long, teenagers who walked too slowly past houses, cars that drove through the neighborhood without stopping. "Mrs. Henderson gets packages from Amazon 3 times a week," he explained matter-of-factly. "That's unusual for a new mother. I needed to document what she was ordering, make sure it wasn't anything dangerous. And the Williams girl has been staying up too late doing homework that could indicate drug use or other problems." I was gathering evidence. The most disturbing revelation came when we searched his house with a second warrant. In his basement office, we found similar surveillance documentation from his previous address in Riverside, California. This wasn't his first neighborhood watch operation. File cabinets contained photos, schedules, and floor plans from at least 3 different neighborhoods where he'd lived over the past 5 years. We contacted authorities in California and learned that several families in Brennan's former neighborhood had reported feeling watched and unsafe before he suddenly moved away. Apparently, he'd been asked to leave by Homeowners Association after complaints about his excessive interest in neighborhood security, but no criminal charges had been filed because no one had discovered the extent of his surveillance. Child Protective Services took custody of Tommy that evening, which was almost as heartbreaking as the original discovery. The kid had no idea what his father was really doing up in that tree. As far as Tommy knew, Daddy was just building him the coolest treehouse in the neighborhood, and now the police had taken it away along with his father. The case made headlines in our local paper, the Millfield Gazette, with the headline, "Local Father Arrested for Elaborate Neighborhood Surveillance Operation." But what they didn't report was how this incident completely shattered the sense of security on Cedar Lane and the surrounding area. The Hendersons moved out within 2 months, unable to sleep in their own bedroom knowing they'd been watched for over a year. Jennifer Henderson developed severe anxiety and couldn't be alone in the house during the day. David Henderson installed security cameras and motion sensors around their property before they moved, but said he never felt safe again. The Williams family installed blackout curtains on every window and a complete security system with cameras pointing outward, essentially turning their home into a fortress. Patricia Williams stopped cooking in the kitchen with the lights on and had to start taking anxiety medication. Ashley Williams required counseling and changed schools, unable to concentrate knowing someone had been watching her in her most private moments. Mrs. Kowalski, who'd been the one to report the suspicious activity, became obsessed with checking for cameras and surveillance equipment in every tree, building, and structure around her house. She had her property professionally swept for listening devices 3 times and installed motion-activated floodlights that lit up her entire yard like a prison compound. The ripple effects spread throughout Millfield. Hardware stores reported increased sales of security cameras, motion sensors, and blackout curtains. The local police department received dozens of calls about suspicious structures, unusual behavior, and requests for security checks. People started looking at their neighbors differently, wondering what secrets might be hidden behind friendly waves and casual conversations. Richard Brennan was charged with multiple felony counts of unlawful surveillance, invasion of privacy, trespassing, and stalking. During sentencing 6 months later, the judge called it one of the most systematic and disturbing violations of community trust he'd ever seen. Brennan received 4 years in state prison, but the psychological damage to our small town's faith in each other was permanent. What haunts me most about this case is how completely normal Richard Brennan seemed to everyone who knew him. He wasn't some obvious creep lurking in shadows or making inappropriate comments. He was a dedicated single father building what everyone thought was an elaborate treehouse for his son. He waved hello every morning, maintained his property better than most neighbors, and seemed genuinely concerned about neighborhood safety and children's welfare. That's what makes this case so terrifying for me as both a law enforcement officer and a member of this community. How do you protect yourself from someone who genuinely believes they're protecting you? How do you identify a threat that presents itself as a solution? I've been thinking about this case a lot lately because 3 weeks ago, I got another call about suspicious construction in a backyard. Different neighborhood, different person, but the same sick feeling in my stomach when I realized what I was looking at. I can't share details about an ongoing investigation, but I will say this: Richard Brennan's methods are apparently more common than any of us realized. So here's my question for all of you. Have you ever really looked at the structures in your neighbors' yards? That garden shed positioned to face your bedroom window, that gazebo with a perfect view of your kitchen, that amateur radio tower that seems positioned just right to overlook your property. What's the strangest thing you've noticed about your neighbors? And have you ever felt like someone was watching you in your own home? Because after what I discovered on Cedar Lane, I've learned that sometimes the most dangerous person in your neighborhood is the one who claims to be looking out for everyone's safety. And sometimes the person who makes you feel most secure is actually the one you should fear the most. My name is Michael Thompson, and I'm a social worker for Millfield County Child Protective Services. I've been doing this job for 8 years, and I thought I'd seen every kind of dysfunction a small town could hide. What happened with Emma Chin last spring taught me that sometimes an entire community can become a predator, and the most innocent arrival can trigger the darkest impulses in people you've trusted your whole life. Emma arrived in Millfield on March 22, 2023, during one of those gray, drizzly days that make our town look like something out of a depressing movie. She was 16 years old, placed in emergency foster care with the Morrison family after her grandmother's sudden death in Portland had left her with nowhere else to go. The state had tracked down her only living relative, a distant cousin, Janet Morrison, who lived on Elm Drive about 6 blocks from where Detective Martinez had made that surveillance arrest 6 months earlier. I was driving my 2017 Toyota Camry through the winding streets of our residential district when I first got the call about Emma. Standard procedure required a home visit within 72 hours of any emergency placement, so I was heading to the Morrison house to conduct the initial welfare check and help Emma transition into her temporary living situation. Janet Morrison was a 45-year-old single woman who worked as a cashier at Millfield Grocery and had volunteered for the emergency foster program 2 years earlier. She'd never actually housed a child before, but her background check was clean and she had a spare bedroom. On paper, it seemed like a reasonable placement for a teenager who'd just lost her only family member. When I arrived at the Morrison house, a modest blue 2-story home with white trim, I immediately noticed something that would later seem significant. There were more people on the usually quiet street than I'd ever seen before. Neighbors were working in their yards, walking dogs, checking mailboxes, all seemingly normal activities except for the timing. It was 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. Most people should have been at work or school. Emma answered the door herself, and I understood immediately why she was drawing attention. She was strikingly beautiful in a way that seemed almost out of place in our small town. Mixed Asian and European heritage, with long black hair, delicate features, and an elegant way of moving that suggested dance or gymnastics training. But what struck me most was how frightened she looked, though she was trying hard to hide it. "You must be Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, glancing nervously over my shoulder at the street. "Mrs. Morrison is at work, but she said you were coming by." As I followed Emma into the house, I caught a glimpse of movement from multiple windows across the street. Curtains falling back into place, shadows moving away from glass. It was subtle, but unmistakable. People were watching. Emma had been enrolled at Millfield High School but hadn't started classes yet due to the timing of spring break. Janet Morrison had thought it would be better to let her settle in for a week before throwing her into a new school environment. What none of us realized was that this delay would give the town's voyeuristic tendencies time to develop and escalate. "How are you adjusting to living here?" I asked as we sat in the Morrisons' small living room. "I know this must be incredibly difficult after losing your grandmother." Emma's composure cracked slightly. "It's different. People here are very attentive. In Portland, nobody really noticed me. Here, I feel like I'm being watched constantly. Mrs. Morrison says it's because I'm new and people are curious, but it feels like more than that." She was right. Over the following weeks, as I conducted my regular check-ins, I began to notice patterns that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Emma couldn't walk to the corner store without attracting a crowd of coincidental encounters. Men would suddenly need to check their mail when she passed by. Women would find reasons to work in their front yards when Emma was outside. The local coffee shop, Millfield Cafe, reported that their afternoon business had tripled since Emma's arrival. The owner, Mrs. Patricia Vance, mentioned that she'd never seen so many middle-aged men suddenly interested in afternoon coffee breaks. They would sit at tables with clear views of the street, lingering over single cups of coffee for hours, all watching the same direction. Even more disturbing were the reports from Janet Morrison when I called for my weekly check-ins. "Michael, I don't know what to do," she told me during our third-week conversation. "People keep stopping by to welcome Emma to the neighborhood. Yesterday, I had 7 different people bring cookies or casseroles. Mr. Peterson from down the street has offered to help Emma with her car 3 times, even though she doesn't have a car. And these aren't quick visits, they're finding excuses to stay and talk to her for 20 or 30 minutes. Emma had started classes at Millfield High on April 10th, and the reports from her teachers were concerning. She was clearly intelligent and well-educated, but she seemed anxious and distracted. More troubling were the reports from other students about adult behavior around the school. Sarah Chin, no relation to Emma, despite the shared surname, a junior at the high school, came to see me in my office on April 18th with information that made my blood run cold. Mr. Thompson, there's something really weird happening with Emma and some of the adults in town, Sarah said, fidgeting nervously with her backpack straps. My mom sent me to pick up my little brother from elementary school yesterday, and I saw Mr. Bradley from the hardware store parked across from the high school just sitting in his truck. When I asked him what he was doing, he said he was waiting for his nephew, but his nephew graduated like 5 years ago. The pattern was becoming clear and deeply disturbing. Emma's schedule was somehow common knowledge throughout the town. People knew when she walked to school, when she had lunch, when she worked her part-time job at the library. This wasn't casual small-town friendliness, this was coordinated surveillance. I decided to conduct an informal investigation, spending several afternoons observing the areas where Emma commonly went. What I discovered was a systematic network of voyeurism that involved far more people than I could have imagined. On April 22nd, I positioned myself at the Millfield Public Library where Emma worked 3 afternoons a week shelving books and helping with the children's reading program. From 3 to 5 p.m., I counted 17 different men who entered the library, most of them claiming to need help finding specific books that coincidentally required Emma's assistance. These weren't regular library patrons. I recognized several of them as people who'd never shown interest in reading before. The library's head librarian, Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, confirmed my suspicions. It's been like this since Emma started working here, she whispered to me near the reference desk. Men I've never seen before suddenly need help finding books in whatever section Emma happens to be working. Yesterday, Tom Bradley asked Emma to help him find a cookbook. Tom Bradley hasn't cooked a meal in his life, his wife does everything. And the way they look at her, it makes my skin crawl. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Emma's image was being shared and discussed online. A concerned parent had found a social media group called Millfield Spotting, where people were posting photos of Emma taken without her knowledge or consent. Pictures of her walking to school, working at the library, sitting in the park reading. The photos were accompanied by comments that ranged from creepy to explicitly sexual. The group had 73 members, including people I recognized as respected members of our community. Teachers, business owners, church members, even a city council member. They were sharing Emma's schedule, discussing her daily routines, and coordinating opportunities to, accidentally, encounter her around town. When I brought this evidence to Police Chief Robert Martinez, Detective Sarah Martinez's father, he was horrified but also concerned about the legal implications. Michael, most of what they're doing isn't technically illegal, he explained grimly. Taking photos in public spaces, being in the same place as she is, even the social media group, it's all protected speech and legal activity. But the pattern of behavior, this is stalking on a community level. The breaking point came on May 3, 2023. Emma called my emergency line at 11:47 p.m., crying and barely coherent. Someone had been in the Morrisons' backyard, looking through her bedroom window. Janet Morrison had found muddy footprints under Emma's window and what appeared to be a small stepladder that had been left behind in the bushes. When I arrived at the house with Officer David Kim in his 2021 Ford Taurus Police Interceptor, we found Emma shaking in the living room while Janet Morrison paced angrily around the kitchen. The physical evidence was clear. Someone had been attempting to look into Emma's second-floor bedroom window, and they'd come prepared with equipment. This has to stop, Janet said, her voice shaking with anger. That girl has been through enough trauma losing her grandmother. She doesn't deserve to be treated like some kind of zoo animal by this sick town. Emma was too frightened to stay in the house that night. We arranged for her to stay with another foster family in the next county while we figured out a long-term solution. As we were loading her belongings into my car, I noticed lights coming on in houses throughout the neighborhood. People were watching her leave, even at midnight. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of what had been happening. The social media group was just the tip of the iceberg. There were text message chains, email groups, and even a crude betting pool about who would successfully ask Emma on a date. Some of the participants were married men with daughters Emma's age. We discovered that Emma's work schedule at the library had been deliberately leaked by someone with access to employee information. Her class schedule at the high school was being shared among adult men who had no business knowing when a teenage girl would be in specific locations. Even her weekly therapy appointments, which were supposed to be confidential, had somehow become public knowledge. The most disturbing revelation came when we traced the stepladder found under Emma's window. It belonged to Frank Morrison, Janet's ex-husband, who had been living in a trailer park outside town since their divorce 3 years earlier. Frank had been part of the online group and had apparently escalated from digital voyeurism to physical stalking. When confronted, Frank broke down and admitted he'd been watching Emma for weeks. "She's so beautiful," he sobbed to Officer Kim during questioning. "I wasn't going to hurt her. I just wanted to see her. Everyone in town was talking about her, sharing pictures. I thought if I could just get a better photo, maybe I could sell it to one of the guys." The criminal charges were limited but significant. Frank Morrison was arrested for criminal trespass and attempted voyeurism. 3 members of the social media group were charged with cyberstalking. The city council member was forced to resign in disgrace. Several businesses in town faced boycotts when their owners were identified as group members. But the real consequence was the complete breakdown of trust in our community. Emma was moved to a foster home in Salem, over an hour away, where she could finish high school without being the subject of community-wide obsession. Janet Morrison, who had tried to provide a safe home for a traumatized teenager, was so disgusted by her neighbor's behavior that she put her house up for sale within a month. The ripple effects were immediate and devastating. Parents began questioning which adults in town could be trusted around their children. The high school implemented new policies about adult visitors and photography. Several families moved away, unable to look at their neighbors the same way after learning about their participation in stalking a teenage girl. What haunts me most about Emma's case is how quickly and completely an entire community can turn predatory. These weren't strangers or obvious threats, they were teachers, coaches, business owners, people who were supposed to be protectors of children in our community. They transformed a grieving teenage girl into an object of entertainment and sexual fantasy, coordinating their voyeurism like some kind of sick hobby group. The psychological evaluation I received after Emma's case concluded that what happened to her was a form of community-enabled abuse. The constant surveillance, the coordinated stalking, the online objectification, it was psychological torture disguised as small-town curiosity. Emma developed severe anxiety and trust issues that required extensive therapy. 6 months after Emma left Millfield, I received a call from Detective Sarah Martinez about a pattern she noticed in recent incident reports. 3 different teenage girls who had moved to town in the past year had reported feeling watched and followed. All 3 had been contacted by the same group of men who had been involved in Emma's stalking. The investigation is still ongoing, but what we've discovered suggests that Emma's case wasn't an isolated incident. There appears to be a systematic pattern in Millfield of adult men targeting vulnerable teenage girls who are new to the community. Girls who don't have established support networks, who are dealing with trauma or family disruption, who are easy to isolate and objectify. We're now working with state authorities to investigate whether this pattern extends to other small towns in our region. The preliminary findings suggest that social media and online coordination have enabled this kind of community-wide predatory behavior in ways that weren't possible before. So here's what I want to ask all of you. Have you ever noticed an entire community becoming obsessed with one person? Have you seen adults paying unusual attention to teenagers who are new to your area? And most importantly, if you witnessed this kind of behavior, would you speak up to protect the victim? Or would you convince yourself it was just harmless curiosity? Because what happened to Emma Chin taught me that the most dangerous predators aren't always individuals acting alone. Sometimes they're entire communities that have collectively decided to treat a vulnerable person as entertainment. And when that happens, the victim has nowhere to run and no one to trust. The system that was supposed to protect Emma, foster care, school, community support, became the very mechanism that enabled her abuse. And that's a failure that goes far beyond any individual criminal act. My name is Rebecca Walsh, and I've been working as a night shift nurse at Millfield Regional Medical Center for 6 years. What started as a simple observation about a fellow customer at our local grocery store turned into a nightmare that made me realize how vulnerable we all are when someone decides to make us their obsession. Sometimes the most terrifying predator is hiding in plain sight, standing right behind you in line. It began on November 8, 2023, around 10:30 p.m. when I stopped at Millfield Market after my shift ended. I usually shopped late because the store was quieter, and after 12 hours of dealing with medical emergencies, I preferred the peaceful atmosphere of nearly empty aisles. I was driving my 2016 Subaru Outback, still wearing my scrubs, just wanting to grab some groceries and get home to my apartment on Birch Street. The first time I noticed him, I was in the checkout line with my usual items: yogurt, salad ingredients, and coffee for the next day's shift. He was standing directly behind me, a man in his 40s with graying brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a navy blue windbreaker and jeans. Nothing particularly memorable about him, except that he seemed to be studying me rather than looking at his phone or the magazine rack like most people do while waiting. When I glanced back, he immediately looked away, pretending to examine a candy bar. I paid for my groceries and left, thinking nothing more about it. Just another late-night shopper at our 24-hour market. 3 days later, November 11th, I was back at the same store around the same time. Different entrance, different aisle route, but when I got to the checkout line, there he was again. Same navy windbreaker, same wire-rimmed glasses, standing directly behind me with a basket containing only a few random items: a can of soup, a pack of gum, a bottle of water. Items that seemed like excuses to be in the store rather than actual necessities. This time, I paid more attention. When the cashier, Maria Santos, greeted me by name, she'd been working there for years and knew most of the regular customers. I noticed the man behind me lean forward slightly, as if trying to hear better. After I paid and walked toward the exit, I looked back through the glass doors and saw him abandon his items at the register and leave the store without purchasing anything. That's when I first felt the cold chill of recognition. This wasn't a coincidence. Over the next 2 weeks, I started documenting what I was seeing. Every time I shopped at Millfield Market, whether it was after my Tuesday night shift, my Thursday evening shift, or my weekend rounds, he was there. Always in line behind me, always with a few meaningless items, always listening intently when staff members used my name. I began varying my routine. I tried shopping at different times, using different entrances, even driving to the Safeway in the next town over. But somehow, he was always there. If I shopped at 10 p.m., he appeared. If I shopped at 11:30 p.m., he appeared. If I went to the pharmacy section first, he'd be browsing nearby. If I started in produce, he'd be examining bananas 2 aisles over. The man was learning my patterns, but more than that, he was learning about me. I realized this on November 26th when I was buying ingredients for a Thanksgiving dish I was bringing to my sister's house. I had picked up cranberries, pecans, and cream cheese for a cranberry walnut cheesecake, a family recipe that wasn't common. When I got to the checkout line, there he was with the exact same ingredients in his basket. "Making cranberry walnut cheesecake?" Maria asked me cheerfully as she scanned my items. "Yes, it's my grandmother's recipe," I replied, and I saw the man behind me pull out his phone and start typing. That night, I called the police. Officer Jennifer Martinez, Detective Sarah Martinez's younger sister, who had joined the force 2 years earlier, took my report, but explained the legal limitations. "Rebecca, I understand how unsettling this must be, but shopping at the same store isn't illegal," she said gently. "Unless he's following you home, making threats, or trying to contact you directly, there's not much we can charge him with. Have you considered shopping elsewhere? I had considered it, but Millfield Market was the only 24-hour grocery store in town, and my nursing schedule made regular business hours impossible. More importantly, I was getting angry. Why should I have to change my entire routine because some creep had decided to make me his project? I decided to try a direct approach. On December 3rd, after he appeared behind me in line for the 8th time, I turned around and confronted him. "Excuse me, but I've noticed you're always behind me in the checkout line. Is there a reason you're following me?" He looked genuinely shocked, his face turning red behind his glasses. "I'm sorry, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I just shop here regularly, same as you. I work late shifts too, so I tend to shop at the same time." His voice was soft, apologetic, with no hint of aggression or hostility. He seemed embarrassed and confused, like someone who'd been wrongly accused. For a moment, I felt foolish for confronting him. "What kind of work do you do?" I asked, testing his story. "I'm a security guard at Millfield Industrial Park," he replied without hesitation. "I get off at 10 p.m. most nights, so I stop here on my way home. I live in the apartments on Maple Avenue." It was a reasonable explanation, and he'd answered without any of the defensive behavior I'd expected from someone with malicious intent. I apologized for the confrontation and tried to convince myself I'd been paranoid. But the following week, I realized how wrong I'd been. The man I later learned his name was Donald Fitzpatrick had used our conversation to gather more information about me. During our brief exchange, I'd mentioned working late shifts, and he'd correctly guessed I was in healthcare based on my scrubs. But somehow, he'd turned that minimal information into a detailed profile of my life. On December 10th, I was shopping for cold medicine because I'd been fighting a respiratory infection that was going around the hospital. When I reached the pharmacy section, Donald Fitzpatrick was already there, holding a package of the same cold medicine I usually bought, a specific brand and formula that most people wouldn't know about unless they'd been watching my purchases. "This stuff works great for respiratory infections," he commented as I approached the shelf. "I see you buying it pretty regularly. You must work in healthcare, lots of exposure to germs." The casual way he mentioned my purchasing patterns made my skin crawl. He'd been cataloging everything I bought, tracking my health issues, building a database of my personal information just by standing behind me in grocery lines. I reported this incident to Officer Martinez, who agreed it was escalating beyond coincidental encounters. She spoke with Donald Fitzpatrick at his apartment, and he maintained his innocence while expressing concern that I was harassing him with false accusations. He was very polite and cooperative. Officer Martinez told me after the interview. He showed me his work schedule, which does align with the times you've been seeing him. He claims he's just doing his shopping and can't help it if you're both night shift workers with similar routines. But Donald had made a crucial mistake during that interview. When Officer Martinez asked about his shopping habits, he mentioned specific details about my purchases that no casual observer would remember. He knew I bought the same brand of coffee every week, that I preferred organic vegetables, that I typically shopped for exactly 3 days' worth of groceries at a time. Either this guy has a photographic memory for random strangers' shopping habits, Officer Martinez said, or he's been documenting your purchases. Neither explanation is normal. That's when we discovered the scope of Donald's obsession. Officer Martinez obtained a warrant to search his apartment on December 18th, based on evidence of stalking behavior. What they found was a detailed surveillance operation that had been running for over 2 months. Donald Fitzpatrick had been photographing me every time I shopped, using his phone to document my purchases, my clothing, my interactions with store employees. His apartment contained hundreds of photos taken inside Millfield Market, most of them focused on me but some including other female customers who shopped during late-night hours. He had created a detailed schedule of my grocery shopping patterns, noting that I typically shopped on Tuesdays and Thursdays after 10 p.m., that I preferred the self-checkout lanes, that I usually spent 15 to 20 minutes in the store. He documented which employees knew me by name, which checkout lanes I preferred, even which parking spaces I typically used. Most disturbing was a notebook containing what he called conversation starters. Detailed observations about my purchases that he could use to initiate casual conversations. He noted that I bought ingredients for homemade meals, suggesting I lived alone. He'd observed that I purchased cold medicine frequently, indicating I worked in a high-exposure environment. He'd even documented my preference for decaffeinated coffee, speculating about my sleep schedule and work hours. The apartment search also revealed that I wasn't his only target. Donald had similar documentation for at least 4 other women who shopped regularly at Millfield Market during late-night hours. All of them were healthcare workers, single women, or others whose jobs required unusual schedules that made them regular late-night shoppers. One of the other victims was Amanda Rodriguez, a pharmacy technician who worked evening shifts at the hospital. She'd mentioned to friends that she felt uncomfortable at the grocery store but couldn't explain why. Another was Lisa Chin, a single mother who worked as a hotel desk clerk and could only shop after her night shifts ended. When Officer Martinez contacted these women, they all reported similar experiences: a man in a navy windbreaker who seemed to be in the store whenever they were, who always ended up behind them in line, who seemed to know too much about their shopping habits and personal routines. Donald Fitzpatrick was arrested on December 19th and charged with multiple counts of stalking, criminal surveillance, and invasion of privacy. During his interrogation, he maintained that he was just being friendly, that he was lonely and hoping to meet someone with similar interests and schedules. "I never threatened anyone," he insisted. "I never followed them home or tried to contact them outside the store. I was just trying to find someone to talk to, maybe ask out for coffee. Is it illegal to notice things about people?" But the evidence told a different story. Donald's surveillance operation was systematic and calculated. He'd been building detailed profiles of vulnerable women, learning their routines, their work schedules, their personal habits. The notebook found in his apartment contained plans for escalating contact with each target, including scenarios for accidental meetings outside the grocery store. Most chilling was a section labeled home addresses, where Donald had been attempting to track where his targets lived by following their cars from the grocery store parking lot. He'd successfully identified the home addresses of 2 women and had begun driving past their apartments and houses during his off hours. The investigation revealed that Donald Fitzpatrick was a registered sex offender who had moved to Millfield 6 months earlier after completing probation for voyeurism charges in Oregon. He'd been required to register with local authorities but had used a false address and had been living in our community without proper monitoring. His previous conviction involved secretly photographing women in retail environments, exactly the same pattern of behavior he'd been exhibiting at Millfield Market. He'd served 18 months in prison and completed 3 years of probation, during which he'd received counseling for what psychologists termed retail voyeurism disorder. The case went to trial in March 2024, where Donald Fitzpatrick was convicted on multiple stalking charges and sentenced to 4 years in state prison. But the psychological damage to his victims was already done. I couldn't shop at Millfield Market for months without feeling anxious and looking over my shoulder. The simple act of buying groceries had become a source of stress and fear. Amanda Rodriguez changed her work schedule to avoid late-night shopping entirely. Lisa Chin started driving to a grocery store 30 minutes away, even though it was inconvenient and expensive. All of us had to alter our routines because one man had decided we were objects for his entertainment and potential romantic pursuit. What makes this case particularly disturbing is how Donald used the normal social environment of a grocery store to conduct his stalking. He wasn't hiding in bushes or following us in dark parking lots. He was standing right behind us in a well-lit, public place, surrounded by other customers and store employees, conducting his surveillance in plain sight. The grocery store's security cameras had captured everything, but because Donald's behavior looked like normal shopping, no one had noticed the pattern. He turned the checkout line into his personal observation post, using the forced proximity and casual social interactions to gather intelligence about his targets. Store management implemented new policies after Donald's arrest, including additional security personnel during late-night hours and training for employees to recognize stalking behavior. But the fundamental vulnerability remains: any public place where people follow predictable routines can become a hunting ground for someone with predatory intentions. The most unsettling aspect of this experience was how long it took for anyone to take my concerns seriously. Donald's behavior was subtle enough to seem innocent to casual observers, but persistent enough to be clearly predatory to his targets. The legal system struggled to address stalking that occurred in public spaces without obvious threats or physical contact. 3 months after Donald's conviction, I received a call from Detective Sarah Martinez about a similar case in the neighboring town of Brookside. A man matching Donald's description and methods had been reported by several women who shopped at a 24-hour pharmacy there. The investigation is ongoing, but it appears that Donald's techniques may have been learned from or shared with others who target vulnerable women in retail environments. So here's what I want to ask all of you. Have you ever noticed the same person appearing behind you in checkout lines repeatedly? Have you felt like someone was paying too much attention to your shopping habits or daily routines? And if you work odd hours or have predictable schedules that take you to the same places at the same times, have you considered how visible and vulnerable those patterns make you? Because what happened to me and the other women Donald targeted taught me that stalkers don't always lurk in shadows. Sometimes they stand right behind you in line, listening to every interaction, cataloging every purchase, building a profile of your life one grocery trip at a time. And by the time you realize what's happening, they may already know more about your routine than your closest friends do. The scariest part isn't what Donald did in those grocery store lines, it's how much information about my life he was able to gather just by paying attention in a public place where I felt completely safe. My name is Officer Kevin Walsh, and I've been with the Millfield Police Department for 9 years. What I discovered in Gregory Hendrick's basement on January 14, 2024, connected all the disturbing incidents our town had been experiencing over the past year. Sometimes the person who appears to be the most caring member of your community is actually the one orchestrating its destruction, and what looks like compassion can mask the deepest kind of control and obsession. The call came in at 6:47 a.m. on a bitter cold Sunday morning. I was driving Unit 31, a 2022 Dodge Charger, responding to what dispatch described as a welfare check with possible animal hoarding situation at 847 Hickory Lane. The caller, Mrs. Dorothy Freeman, had reported strange sounds coming from her neighbor's basement and a horrible smell that had been getting worse over the past week. Gregory Hendricks had lived on Hickory Lane for 4 years, ever since moving to Millfield after retiring from his job as a veterinary technician in Sacramento. He was 58 years old, lived alone in a large 2-story house with a full basement, and was known throughout the neighborhood as someone who genuinely cared about animals. Everyone called him Doc Greg, even though he wasn't actually a veterinarian. Doc Greg was the person you called when you found an injured bird, when your cat went missing, or when you needed advice about a sick pet. He'd helped reunite dozens of lost dogs with their owners, treated wounded wildlife, and even paid veterinary bills for families who couldn't afford emergency care for their pets. In a town that had been shaken by surveillance scandals and stalking incidents, Doc Gregg seemed like one of the few genuinely good people left. When I arrived at his house, Mrs. Freeman was waiting on her front porch, wrapped in a thick winter coat and looking deeply distressed. She was in her 70s, a retired school teacher who had lived next door to Doc Gregg since he moved in. "Officer Walsh, I'm so sorry to call, but something is very wrong over there," she said, pointing toward Doc Gregg's house. "The sounds coming from his basement have been going on for days, animals crying, scratching, what sounds like dozens of them. And the smell, it's getting into my house through the shared wall." As I approached Doc Gregg's property, I immediately noticed what Mrs. Freeman was talking about. There was a distinct odor of animal waste, wet fur, and something else, a sickly sweet smell that made my stomach turn. The sounds were unmistakable: dogs barking, cats meowing, and other animal noises coming from beneath the house. I knocked on the front door, and Doc Gregg answered wearing a bathrobe and slippers, looking like he'd just woken up. He was a tall, thin man with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the picture of a harmless retiree. "Officer Walsh, good morning," he said with a warm smile. Is everything all right? I hope Mrs. Freeman isn't having trouble with her heating system again. I keep telling her she needs to have that furnace serviced. Mr. Hendricks, we've received reports about animal sounds coming from your basement. I need to ask you some questions about any pets you might have on the property. Doc Greg's expression changed slightly, not defensive or angry, but concerned in the way someone might look when they realize they need to explain a complicated situation. Oh, officer, I should have thought to notify the authorities, he said, opening the door wider. I've been caring for several animals that were abandoned or injured. You know how it is in a small town, people dump pets they can't care for, and I can't bear to see them suffer. I have some cats and dogs in the basement where it's warm and safe while I nurse them back to health. It sounded reasonable, even admirable. Doc Greg had a reputation for animal rescue, and it wouldn't be unusual for someone with his background to take in strays. But the smell was getting stronger, and the volume of animal sounds suggested far more than several animals. I'd like to take a look at your setup, if you don't mind, I said. We need to make sure everything is safe and legal, both for the animals and for neighborhood health concerns. Of course, Doc Greg agreed readily. I completely understand. Let me just get dressed and I'll show you everything. I'm actually proud of what I've been able to accomplish. I think I've saved over 30 animals in the past few months. 30 animals? In a residential basement. Red flags were going up everywhere. Doc Greg led me through his house, which was meticulously clean and decorated with animal photos and veterinary certificates from his previous career. As we approached the basement door, the sounds grew louder and the smell became overwhelming. What I saw when he opened that door will haunt me for the rest of my life. The basement had been converted into what Doc Greg called his animal sanctuary, but it was actually a horrifying prison. Dozens of dogs, cats, rabbits, and even some chickens were crammed into makeshift cages, kennels, and wire enclosures that filled every inch of the basement floor. The animals were standing in their own waste, many showing signs of malnutrition and disease, all of them clearly distressed. My God! I whispered, pulling out my radio to call for backup and animal control. I know it looks overwhelming, Doc Greg said quickly, seemingly oblivious to the horror of what I was seeing. But you have to understand, these animals would all be dead if I hadn't saved them. Every single one of them was abandoned, injured, or scheduled to be euthanized. I couldn't let that happen. As I moved through the basement, documenting what I was seeing, I began to recognize some of the animals. A golden retriever that looked exactly like Buddy, the Henderson family's dog that had gone missing 3 weeks earlier. A gray tabby cat that matched the description of Smokey, who had disappeared from the Williams family's yard 2 months ago. A small white rabbit that could have been Princess, the pet that had vanished from the Morrison family's backyard hutch. Doc Greg, I said carefully, some of these animals look like pets that have been reported missing in our area. Can you tell me where you found them? His expression became more animated, excited even. Oh yes, I've been keeping detailed records of every rescue, he said, pulling out a thick notebook from a shelf. You see, most people in this town don't take proper care of their animals. Dogs left outside in cold weather, cats allowed to roam unsupervised, rabbits kept in inadequate housing. I couldn't stand by and watch them suffer. The notebook was filled with entries dating back 8 months, detailing what Doc Greg called rescue operations. But as I read through his meticulous handwriting, I realized these weren't rescues, they were thefts. He had systematically stolen pets from yards, porches, and even homes throughout Millfield, convincing himself that he was saving them from neglectful owners. I've been watching every household in town, he explained proudly, taking notes on how people treat their animals, identifying cases of neglect or abandonment. When I see an animal that needs help, I intervene. It's what any compassionate person would do. The entries in his notebook were chilling in their detail. He knew the schedules of every pet owner in town, when dogs were let out, when cats were fed, when owners left for work. He'd been conducting surveillance on the entire community, but instead of targeting people like Richard Brennan had done, he'd been targeting their beloved pets. This golden retriever, I said, pointing to Buddy. Belongs to the Henderson family. They've been searching for him for weeks, putting up flyers, offering a reward. Doc Gregg's face darkened. The Hendersons left that dog outside for hours in below freezing weather. I documented it multiple times. The poor animal was shivering, probably developing hypothermia. They clearly didn't deserve to have a pet. Animal Control Officer Maria Santos arrived with backup, and what followed was a 6-hour operation to safely remove and document every animal in Doc Gregg's basement. The final count was 47 animals, 23 dogs, 18 cats, 4 rabbits, and 2 chickens. Many were suffering from malnutrition, respiratory infections, and psychological trauma from overcrowding. As we processed each animal, we began reuniting them with their families through missing pet reports and microchip identification. The reunions were heartbreaking. Families who had given up hope of ever seeing their beloved pets again, children who had cried themselves to sleep for weeks, elderly people who had lost their only companions. But the most disturbing discovery came when we found Doc Gregg's surveillance logs in his upstairs office. He had been watching every household in Millfield, documenting not just pet care but family routines, work schedules, and daily activities. His observations connected directly to the other incidents our town had experienced over the past year. Doc Gregg had detailed notes about Richard Brennan's surveillance operation, including the exact dates when Brennan had been arrested and when his treehouse had been dismantled. He documented Emma Chen's arrival in town and the community's obsessive interest in her. He'd even recorded information about Donald Fitzpatrick's grocery store stalking, including which late-night shoppers owned pets that might be vulnerable to neglect. You see, I realized our town had a serious problem with people not taking care of what's important, Doc Gregg explained during his interrogation. First, I noticed the surveillance and stalking people were so focused on watching each other that they were ignoring their animals. Then I saw how the community treated that poor girl Emma, and I knew I had to do something to protect the innocent creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. In his twisted logic, Doc Gregg had appointed himself as Millfield's savior, not just of animals but of the entire community's moral fabric. He believed that by removing pets from what he deemed inadequate homes, he was teaching people to be more responsible and caring. The investigation revealed that Doc Gregg's animal rescue operation had been escalating for months. He'd started by taking genuinely stray or abandoned animals, but as his basement filled up and his sense of mission grew stronger, he'd begun targeting pets that he decided were being neglected based on his own impossible standards. A dog left outside for an hour was abandoned. A cat that looked thin was starving. A rabbit in an outdoor hutch was exposed to the elements. Any pet that wasn't receiving what Doc Gregg considered perfect care became a target for his nighttime rescue missions. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed that Gregory Hendricks suffered from a complex delusion that combined genuine animal welfare concerns with severe control issues and paranoid thinking. He'd convinced himself that he was the only person in Millfield capable of properly caring for animals, and that removing pets from their homes was not only justified but morally required. Most disturbing was the discovery that Doc Gregg had been planning to expand his operation. Notes found in his house detailed plans for a larger facility where he could house hundreds of animals rescued from throughout the county. He'd been researching abandoned buildings and rural properties where he could establish what he called a permanent sanctuary for neglected animals. The legal consequences were severe. Gregory Hendricks was charged with 47 counts of theft, multiple counts of animal endangerment, breaking and entering, and criminal surveillance. Many of the animals required extensive veterinary care, and 3 didn't survive the conditions in his basement. He was sentenced to 8 years in state prison and banned from owning or caring for animals for life. But the emotional damage to our community was immeasurable. Families who had trusted Doc Gregg with their pet emergencies felt betrayed and violated. Parents had to explain to children why the nice man who had helped their sick hamster had actually stolen their dog. The sense of security that comes from having helpful neighbors was destroyed. The case also revealed how the previous incidents in Millfield had created an atmosphere of suspicion and surveillance that enabled Doc Gregg's crimes. People were so focused on watching each other that they hadn't noticed someone was systematically stealing their pets. The community's attention had been diverted by human predators while an animal predator operated freely among them. What haunts me most about this case is how Doc Gregg's genuine love for animals became twisted into something destructive and criminal. His veterinary background and history of helping pets gave him access to homes and trust that he exploited. People would call him when their animals were sick, giving him detailed information about their pets' routines and their families' schedules. The investigation also revealed connections between all 4 major incidents our town had experienced. Richard Brennan's surveillance had documented several pet thefts that he'd witnessed but never reported, apparently more interested in watching human behavior than protecting animals. The community's obsession with Emma Chin had distracted from missing pet reports. Donald Fitzpatrick's grocery store stalking had included gathering information about which customers owned pets, information that he'd somehow shared with Doc Gregg through their mutual interest in late-night routines. Our small town's breakdown of trust and normal social boundaries had created an environment where multiple predators could operate simultaneously, each feeding off the chaos and distraction created by the others. Doc Gregg had taken advantage of a community so focused on human threats that they'd ignored an animal predator hiding in plain sight. 6 months after Doc Gregg's arrest, families are still dealing with the trauma. Some pets never fully recovered from their time in his basement. Several families moved away, unable to trust their neighbors or feel safe letting their pets outside. The local animal shelter implemented new protocols for volunteer screening after learning how professional credentials and good reputations could mask predatory behavior. What happened with Gregory Hendricks taught me that the most dangerous criminals are often those who present themselves as helpers and protectors. Doc Gregg wasn't some obvious animal abuser, he was the person everyone called when they needed help with a sick pet. He used his genuine expertise and apparent compassion to gain access to homes, build trust with families, and gather intelligence for his crimes. The scariest part is how his delusion of being a savior allowed him to commit increasingly serious crimes while maintaining his self-image as a good person. In his mind, he wasn't stealing beloved family pets, he was rescuing suffering animals from inadequate care. That self-justification made him incredibly dangerous because it removed any internal limits on his behavior. So here's what I want to ask all of you. Do you really know the people in your community who have access to your homes and your families? The veterinarian, the pet sitter, the helpful neighbor who offers to watch your animals when you travel? And if someone in your neighborhood suddenly became the go-to person for animal emergencies, would you question how they gained that expertise or why they're so available to help? Because what Doc Gregg taught me is that the person who seems most dedicated to protecting what you love might actually be planning to take it away from you. And sometimes the greatest threat to your family's safety comes from the person you trust most to keep them safe. In the end, all 4 cases that shook our town, the surveillance treehouse, the community stalking, the grocery store predator, and the animal thief, were connected by the same fundamental breakdown: people who used positions of trust and apparent helpfulness to exploit and harm others. Millfield learned that predators don't always announce themselves as threats. Sometimes they present themselves as the solution to the very problems they're creating. Thanks so much for watching. I can't express enough how much your support means. The likes, the comments, it all really helps the channel grow. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. I always take the time to read them. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on any new videos. See you next time.